The refuge headquarters remains closed to the public, but tribal leaders were allowed in to survey the damage. Jarvis Kennedy is a Burns Paiute tribal council member. He and the other leaders saw 3 trenches dug by the occupiers, as well as a newly built road.
It's kind of overwhelming, kind of got me mad, and of course after anger you get sad, and you just got to realize that it's over and done with, that now we just got to deal with the aftermath and try to move forward from there.
Historically, the refuge was a vital wintering ground for the tribe. Much of the area is now a protected archaeological site. The tribe is planning to hold a private cleansing ceremony at the refuge this spring. Amanda Peacher, OPB News, Burns.
Those documents were given to OPB by an Oregon County official and were prepared by the FBI on February 13th. They shed some light on the scope of the investigation and peacekeeping efforts. Some $52,000 were spent on lodging law enforcement officers, while another $35,000 went towards covering mileage reimbursements. Harney County Schools spent $16,000 to beef up security and provide counseling for students. But the biggest expenditure went to overtime. For law enforcement alone, that cost was more than $400,000. And those costs do not count what state and federal agencies spent, while state lawmakers are asking federal officials for the same. John Sepulvero, OPB News.
This is OPB News. I'm Kate Davidson. Reporters were allowed back onto the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge today for the first extended visit since occupiers seized the federal property in early January. Federal officials wanted to show damage they say was caused by the armed occupiers and to talk about how recovery is going. They also took the opportunity to talk about other sorts of damage, the kind caused by politics. OPB's John Sepulvero was at the refuge today, and he joins me on the line. Hi, John.
Hi, Kate.
So, John, what did you see at the refuge today?
Well, it looked like your run-of-the-mill refuge with a 20,000-acre lake and brush all around. For those who were following the occupation that was happening, they might remember there was a lot of snow on the landscape here. It was very white and barren-looking. We're seeing a lot of it, kind of come to life now as we head into spring. There are lots of birds out, and the air is filled with bird songs, and cattle are grazing on nearby fields. So it looked in many ways very idyllic. It was a beautiful part of nature. But we saw some very small signs of the occupation at this point. And what I mean by that is...
John, let me get you to say that again. We can hear you're on a cell phone in the middle of Harney County there. Say it again.
That's right. So I basically, the parts of the occupation that were left are kind of these little weird reminders, like there are cigarette butts in strange places. There's a camera. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, very poorly, I should say, tried to hide a camera so that it can kind of keep tabs on who's coming and going out of the refuge. But overall, it does not look like a place that was ever occupied for a night, let alone 41. It looks like your run-of-the-mill National Wildlife Center. Of course, the buildings are still remain closed, and the headquarters is not open yet.
Was there any specific damage that officials pointed out, or not so much?
Most of the damage that was done that we saw at the end of the occupation, so these are trucks being moved and trenches being built filled with human feces and all that kind of stuff, all that's gone. I didn't see any evidence of that remaining. What I did see, though, is, again, kind of this larger in the damage. There was there's problems with the water. The septic system has been breached. There's no telephone lines yet, and these are all because those lines and the septic system itself were all compromised as the militants dug into the ground in one of the numerous roads they made, or something like that. And there's some serious concerns, and I want to make sure that I'm not being lying on this. There's some serious concerns about the artifact of the Burns Paiute tribe, and I didn't get an answer on perhaps what's missing or what's damaged. Part of that is because of the ongoing prosecution of the militants.
John, how much did federal officials tackle the politics of what happened during the takeover?
Well, I think that there's a recognition at this point that they need to tackle it, and so we saw that. We saw the director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Dan Ash, come out, and he said that this idea of land transfer, which we're seeing this idea appear in Congress, and of course OPB and others have reported about the allegations between Bundy and state lawmakers, Ammon Bundy and state lawmakers. He said that it's something that needs to be talked about, but then he said this.
As to the idea of transferring of land, that's not a solution. That's political rhetoric. I think what we see here again is a landscape that's managed well, and it's managed in partnership with a local community. Well, that's what we need more of.
And so he really talked, Kate, about the collaboration we see here in Harney County between federal, state, and local stakeholders, specifically around sage grouse habitat. Obviously, OPB has talked about extensively, and other partnerships that really involve all the players at all the levels to try and come to some consensus decision making. And he, along with Secretary Sally Jewell, who was here earlier this week, really made that point over and over again that collaboration is not easy. It doesn't make for easy sound bites, but it's the better way to live. And that was the point he made repeatedly.
And John, let me ask you very quickly, are refuge employees back at work now?
Yeah, they are. In fact, I talked to Linda Sue Beck. Listeners might remember she's the woman who handles the carp biology at the lake. She's back, and she told a very heart-wrenching story about having to leave in the middle of the night and where she was at and being away, and then coming back to a divided community. So they are back at work, but it's clear that the psychological damage is nowhere near as recovered as the physical aspects of the refuge.
That's OPB's John Sepulveda reporting from Burns about the opening of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge to the media today. John, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Let's just start this over. County leaders said they were pleased that the 41-day occupation ended, but the resolution sends the message that out-of-county militants are not welcome in Grant County and that county officials will continue to collaborate with state and government agencies. The meeting was standing room only, and perspectives on the resolution were mixed. Some took issue with resolution language referring to militants. Frances Preston says she sympathized with the occupation leaders' frustrations with the federal government.
I never saw them one time as a militant. They were voices of reason.
Resolution supporters said it was important that Grant County take a stand, even though the occupation is now over.
My contention is that it is as relevant and more relevant than ever.
Kay Steele expressed worry that Grant County could become a target for potential future occupations. The resolution passed unanimously by the county court. Amanda Peacher, OPB News, Canyon City.
Both local and FBI officials spoke during Tuesday's press conference on the investigation into the shooting death of Robert Lavoy Finicum. He was one of the occupiers of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. But there was a sharp contrast between what local and federal officials would say about the investigation. Amanda Peacher takes us through the sometimes confusing comments of these officials.
The big question of the investigation was whether the gunshots that killed Lavoy Finicum were justified uses of deadly force. Malheur County District Attorney Dan Norris is specific in saying that shots fired by Oregon State troopers were necessary, including the 3 that struck Finicum.
Of the 8 shots fired, the 6 fired by the Oregon State Police were justified and, in fact, necessary.
So there were 8 shots, and so far 6 of the 8 were deemed justified. Here's Deschutes County Sheriff Shane Nelson explaining that those other 2 shots were from the FBI's Hostage Rescue Team, or HRT.
During the course of our investigation, we discovered evidence that an FBI HRT operator fired 2 shots as Mr. Finicum exited the truck.
That's different from what FBI Special Agent Greg Bretzing says about those gunshots.
In between the 2 series of shots fired by OSP troopers, 1 and possibly 2 additional shots were fired by law enforcement as Mr. Finicum was exiting his vehicle immediately after hitting the snowbank. The question of who fired these shots has not been resolved.
So we have local law enforcement saying 2 shots came from the FBI, and the FBI saying the question of who fired and how many shots is unresolved. That piece of this story is now being investigated by the Federal Inspector General's office. That investigation will also look at the fact that the HRT operators didn't disclose during the investigation that they fired those shots. Here's another contrast. Every time District Attorney Dan Norris spoke about the use of deadly force, he was careful to refer only to the 6 shots from state troopers. it wasn't his duty to scrutinize the shots that came from the FBI.
I have concluded that all six shots fired by the Oregon State Police, the 3 into the truck, and the 3 that struck Mr. Finnegan, are justified.
But when Greg Bretzing from the FBI talks about the use of deadly force, he speaks more vaguely about law enforcement.
The threat Mr. Finnegan posed to OSP troopers and agents along Highway 395 on that day was real and imminent, and certainly justified the use of deadly force by law enforcement.
So we hear D.A. Norris being specific about OSP's use of deadly force and Bretzing generalizing. The investigation was supposed to clear up questions about law enforcement action. Instead, those 2 questionable gunshots are in some ways raising more suspicions about the occupation, Finnecum's death, and the FBI's role. There is one more notable detail in Bretzing's statement.
The FBI has worked in partnership with Harney County and our law enforcement partners across the state to resolve the situation at the refuge.
Bretzing said that no one wanted the situation to end in violence. Despite the death of Lavoy Finnecum, Bretzing characterized the resolution of the occupation as peaceful.
Hundreds and hundreds of FBI employees traveled to Burns with the sole purpose of bringing this situation to a peaceful conclusion. Working together with our partners, we have been able to do just that.
And that claim, that the incident came to a peaceful conclusion, was something said only by the FBI. For OPB News, I'm Amanda Peacher in Bend.
You can follow Amanda on Twitter @Amanda Peacher, and for more on the investigation into Lavoy Finnecum's death, visit our website, opb.org.